Sure. Our wonderful God, holy and mighty are you. We thank you again for the opportunity to gather here, though we may be few in numbers, Lord. We ask that you bless us. Bless those who could not join us as well. We ask, Lord, your grace and presence in our meeting today, in our discussion, and in all the learnings. And help us, Lord God, to be ready each and every moment. We love you, dear Jesus. Amen.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to do the slideshow. I do have some board work done. We may look at that as a review in just a little bit. Let me get a slideshow on here. I just did the same thing I did last time. I didn't have the title page changed, and I thought, what? I have the wrong file again. But that's the right file.
Oops.
It's the right file. I just forgot the title in there.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so this was number 2 of Guadalupe presentation, Homage Through Hatred. Now, I know I've kind of asked this, so how is everybody doing in keeping up and not keeping up, but yeah, keeping up, but I mean in understanding the line of the Protestants in the 3 histories and how the 3 structures each have those 3 histories. Is everybody understanding the Protestant line more and more?
A little bit more.
A little bit more?
I think so. For me, it's like when you do a visual, like write it out and it's like, okay, did you understand this? Like, oh yeah, I totally understand that. But to ask the question, I always like, I'm not sure, like, you know what I'm saying? It's like when I see it, I'm like, yeah, I remember that. But just to say it out loud, it's hard for me to picture.
Yeah. Let me throw up the, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see that if I put it up there like that. You can't really see it that well right now, right? I have to move it. I don't think you can see it. How are you guys on it at all?
Yeah, I can see it's 25,000 years ancient and then modern.
I got dogs in here around me too, so. Okay.
The only part that's hard to read is like in the little box down at the bottom.
That's okay. I was going to review that part, but I did make it small just to be on the but this was the line of Protestantism. We'll look at it in the slideshow. But she's gone through the First Great Awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys can hear me okay too, right?
Yeah.
You talk down here. She's gone through the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. This was like in the 1700s. This was 1798. The Second Great Awakening through to 1844. And the issues were always, it goes under different phrases, but always the liberal conservative split. And in the First Great Awakening, it was the old side with the new side. We trace this all the way back. We've been reading A.T. Jones and tracing it back to John Knox in Scotland, and the Presbyterians, the Covenanters, the National Reform, which comes in here, is all the same people. This conservative side of Protestantism. So you have these issues over the old side versus the new side. The new side was coming up with, I want to say new ideas. I think I can remember Princeton is in this time, I think, but coming up with new ideas and getting away from the strict Calvinistic ideas. And so there's a battle here, and then you have the Second Great Awakening, and you have the old school, new school in the battles that took place here. But then you come into, so you have Second Great Awakening, 1844. Now these same people, the National Reform Association, that comes all the way back from John Knox, which we showed from those, we saw from those documents by A.T. Jones, that the National Reform Association, the Covenanters, and the Reformed Presbyterian Church were all the same. So this is where they formed the National Reform Association during the Civil War and wanting to get God back into government. Whereas you had the abolitionists and Ellen White saying that the Civil War was judgment against this nation for slavery, you had this conservative sect of Protestantism that wants to, or is saying that the nation is being judged because of taking God, not having God in the government. We got to put God in the government. So they're looking to amend the Constitution in this history. Then there's a free religious movement that comes up against this, to be against this. Then you have in this history after the 1900s, you have World War I and World War II take place. You come into the 40s and 50s, and that's what we're gonna, actually that's the next study when we do Billy Graham, go into that study. This study is gonna focus more on this area here. But by now, after World War II, you've got the issue of what Hitler did and with the Jews, and the United States doesn't want to have that black mark on them, so they embrace the Jews, and we become a Judeo-Christian nation. So since the Jews keep Sabbath was no longer an issue, they're no longer the threat. So you see there's threats here, which we'll go through in the study, and the threats that are here are Catholicism, freethinkers, Catholics, freethinkers, Adventists, and Jews. But over here, it's not the Jews anymore, and it's not the Adventists. And this is the time where we didn't want to be called a cult, and pretty much started to meld in more with Protestantism until you get down here, we're practically part of them. So you've got the Judeo-Christian, the first movement, the second movement, and the third movement. And so coming out of this second movement, you have the civil rights issues, civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and then Stonewall. So you have racism, sexism, and then homophobia going on here, leading up to our history. So if I understand correctly, that's actually the threat. And now the moral majority and everything that takes place going forward is the response, and to try to no longer amend the Constitution, because here they wanted to amend the Constitution. Here it was kind of a mixture between amend the Constitution and interpret it as if we're a Christian nation. And here it's all about interpretation. They just interpret it as a Christian nation, so you no longer need to amend the Constitution. So that's and so it's coming into this history, it's basically the social, actually through all of it, but it becomes more focused on capitalism, but it's the social gospel. The new school, they believed in helping people, because when you get into this history here, prior to the 40s, when you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, and after the Depression, start up the New Deal, they saw that as that was a threat in here that brought about this response, because they see communism and socialism coming in, and they're totally against communism and socialism, and so that's where you wind up coming into capitalism. Any comments or questions?
Mhm.
Is that an okay review? You got it?
Yeah, good review. Thank you.
That's good.
Thank
And then
you.
the box you can't read is really just the three history, or the three structures: God's people, Adventism, the counterfeit papacy, and Protestantism, and in God we trust. And then there are three histories: two histories of failure, and then history of success. Okay. So let me put this back real quick.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. I got to dance around the dog. So
That was good. Very helpful.
okay. Okay, so we'll put the slideshow back on. Okay, so this was her number. Yeah, I'm on the right one. When I work on multiple ones at the same time, I forget where I'm at, but we're on Homage.
Number 2.
Yeah, number 2, Homage from Hatred, right? Yeah. So in our previous study, we looked at Acts 27. I'm trying to answer some questions that seem disconnected, but I tend to suggest it's all connected. Acts 27 is one of my favorite lines. A place not far from where I used to live. It's a beautiful place by the ocean called Apollo Bay. And I pulled a picture, so that's actually Apollo Bay. And there's this mountain you can climb, but really it's a hill. We'd walk to the top of this hill, and all of those flat earth theorists out there, you could look out over the sea and observe the curvature of the earth from horizon to horizon. That's what the ship of Alexandria is for us. To stand back and look at the horizons of modern Israel, 1798 in one direction and the second advent in the other. As you would expect, we lose some fine details when you're standing back at such a distance, but it gives us a unique perspective. What I find that's, for me, how it helps me to understand it, but when you get into the fine details, it can be really complicated and confusing. But when you put together all these fine details and then you step back, it really helps the big picture become more clear. Hopefully that made sense. So all the details, like she says, it seems like things are disconnected. So it's all these details and it seems like things are disconnected, but you bring in all these different details and all these different histories and they become connected, and then you can start to see the picture. So this is the line of Alexandria, leaving at 1798 at the time of the end. It's filled with wheat and loaded with wheat. It's Alexandria's protector or defender of the people. So it starts out this journey. It goes through this 1844, Myra and Lycia, the bitter harvest experience. And then it gets to 1863, where it turns south and gets off course, and it never gets back on course. You have the 126 years here that brings you to 1989, our time of the end, or Lycia, where you have the wise, Lycia meaning wise. And then you have 2001 or 9/11, and you have Euroclydon. And what do we remember destroys Adventism at 2001 at 9/11? What destroys Adventism? Because we know that by the shipwreck is inevitable at 9/11, and what caused it?
Is it spiritualism? No.
Yeah, one day we're all going to get it right. Because that's what we've been stuck on for so long. That's what we've learned so long, but it's not spiritualism. You think about how we study. Hey, here you go. Here. How do we study?
Thus saith the Lord.
No? Anybody?
Methodology.
The methodology. And the methodology is what?
Line upon line.
And
Parable teaching.
parable teaching. So parable teaching actually brought the ruin to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, bringing it to where by refusing to accept it, because in 1989 we saw line upon line, then we saw the increase of knowledge, and then we get to the formalization. You have Daniel 11:40 to 45. I think Daniel 11:40 45 is 1991, and then it's formalized. And so, but Adventism refused and rejected the message in 2001. They pretty much had sealed their fate. It's just a matter of who's going to come out. And so then you have what we had known as midnight cry and shipwreck for this particular line, not for the people, but for the ship. And hey guys, stop. And then you have shipwreck or Sunday law. And I'm watching the things. I don't know if anybody saw what happened with Liz Cheney today. What we saw was probably going to happen. Did anybody see the news on that?
Just
Yes.
that they voted her out.
They voted her out. And I don't know if you read that article I posted in WhatsApp, but her comments were that this is gonna, I don't remember, I'm poorly paraphrasing, gonna destroy the Republican Party and possibly the United States. And sure enough, that's where they're headed.
Yes, very much.
Yeah, so that's going to be their, it sounds like that's going to be their destruction. And so we still have a lot to learn about, this history as we get nearer to it. But we do know that the papacy is involved. So anyways, so I'll go ahead and just go on to read it. So in reviewing the line of Alexandria, that ship that protects the people, I wanted to complete the last two dispensations, these two dispensations here. Particularly that which relates to the close of probation to the second advent, this history here, as Paul is picked up by the second ship of Alexandria, the Castor and Pollux. They land at Syracuse and Rhegium, finally coming to the destination of all the ships of Alexandria, and that's at Puteoli. So the ship picks up Paul, the second ship of Alexandria, to take him take where the ships the ships of Alexandria go, their destination is Puteoli, to where they take the wheat to, and then it's distributed. So the second reason I wanted to look at this line is to consider the shipwreck. Why is it here that the institution is destroyed? So why is it at the Sunday law that the institution is destroyed? In this history, from horizon to horizon, we have three other storylines from 1798, horizon to horizon. She's referring to 1798 to the Second Advent. We have three other storylines. They tell us what happens with the papacy, Protestantism, and modern Israel. So that would be the counterfeit, in God we trust, and God's people. I'm going to combine the two, the line of Alexandria, with the story of Protestantism, also so we can study and understand the Sunday law waymark. And we learned in the last study too about how the Protestants pay homage to the papacy by keeping Sunday. And I did send out that the Catholic Mirror. I don't know if anybody has read it. I know that I've been through some of it years ago, but it hasn't. But I haven't looked at it recently. But I'm aware of some of the quotes that they use. But by keeping Sunday, by the Protestants keeping Sunday, that's how they're paying homage to the papacy. And the papacy calls it that as well. So we asked, why is Adventism shipwrecked here? And we went back to our favorite book, The Great Controversy, where Ellen White tells us the authority of the United States would be used to enforce an observance, and this observance in itself is an act of homage to the papacy. So whatever the United States is going to enforce an observance, and that observance is an act of homage to the papacy. So we used that to go back to our document, How the Constitution Became Christian, which is discussing the story of Protestantism and three attempts by Protestantism to pay homage to the papacy. So that's what we were just talking about on the board, the three attempts to pay homage to the papacy by Protestantism. The 1863 to 1900s history, the 1940s and 50s history, and then our current history, 79 to the end. I'm going to start with that first history, 1863. When I say 1900, I know I'm being vague. I'm not trying to give some specific end date, but I'm covering the history well after 1888. We looked at our document, even just in the introduction on page 263, it will tell you why that movement within Protestantism began. That's because of one segment of Protestant society felt threatened. And who did they feel threatened by? And on page 263, it will tell us. This is the document by Jared A. Goldstein and how Protestantism pays homage. The first history is 1863 to the 1900s. And the threat was the free thinkers. This was the growing influence party of Charles Darwin, the Jews, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Catholics. So this is where the document starts to poke you in the eye, because it's Catholics as a threat that I want to highlight. What is the relationship between the papacy and Protestantism in 1863 to 1900? It's enmity. Do you really believe that? If you do, then we're in a good place. But we need to understand that Protestantism and the papacy are not friends. And much of Adventism is waiting for them to join in friendship to do the work that they're going to do. So the first in history is 1863 to 1900. So the problem is, I think some of you don't believe that. I think some of you still think that Protestantism and Catholicism were friends in 1888. That's why when people see Pope Francis today and Donald Trump, and they don't look like friends, people have a problem. We'll look at the nativist movement, the persecution of Irish Catholics, especially in 1844. Is there a friendship between Catholicism and Protestantism in the history of 1888? Every version of history will tell you no. So why are we expecting one today? So we're going to look a little bit at the nativists in this particular presentation. She suggested somebody do a presentation on it. We're not going to do a full presentation on it, but we're going to look at a little bit of that history now. This is from the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia. It's the Nativist Riots of 1888. And the link is there if you wanted to look it up. So there's a few pages of this just to go through some of this history. In May and July 1844, Philadelphia suffered some of the bloodiest rioting of the antebellum period as anti-immigrant mobs attacked Irish American homes and Roman Catholic churches before being suppressed by the militia. The violence was part of a wave of riots that convulsed American cities starting in the 1830s. Yet even amid this tumult, they stand out for their duration, itself a product of nativist determination to use xenophobia for political gain. In the aftermath of the riots, shocked Philadelphians began debating new methods of maintaining order, a discussion that contributed to the consolidation of Philadelphia County in 1854. Ethnic and religious antagonism had a long history in the city. Since the 1780s, Irish textile workers had come to Philadelphia after losing their jobs to mechanization in the British Isles. As early as 1828, when an off-duty watchman was killed after disparaging bloody Irish transports, Catholic presence had provoked anxiety among American and Irish-born Protestants. In 1831, Irish Catholics battled along Fifth Street with Protestants celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Boyne. I don't know if that's how you say that, Boyne. Anti-Catholic agitation increased in the early 1840s, organized in part around a perceived threat to the Bible in the public schools. Catholic Bishop Francis Patrick Kenrick, 1796 to 1863, an Irish immigrant himself, objected to Protestant teachers leading students in singing Protestant hymns and requiring them to read from the King James Bible. Nativists used Kenrick's complaints to gain followers. In 1842, dozens of Protestant clergymen formed the American Protestant Association to defend America from Romanism. In early 1843, editor Lewis Levin made the Daily Sun an organ for attacks against Catholicism and Catholic immigration. And in December of that year, he helped found a nativist political party, the American Republican Association. In 1844, the Bible controversy intensified in the district of Kensington, a suburb to the northeast of Philadelphia City, and home to many Irish immigrants, both Protestant and Catholic. In February, Hugh Clark, a Catholic school director there, suggested suspending Bible reading until the school board could devise a policy acceptable to Catholics and Protestants alike. Nativists saw this as a threat to their liberty and as a chance to mobilize voters, and they rallied by the thousands in Independence Square. On May 3rd, 1844, they rallied in Kensington itself, but were chased away. The first serious violence broke out 3 days later. On May 6th, the nativists reassembled in Kensington, provoking another fight, during which a young nativist named George Schiffler was fatally shot. By day's end, the second man, apparently a bystander, was dead, and several more nativists were wounded, 2 mortally. The next day, the 1st Brigade of Pennsylvania Militia, commanded by Brigadier General George Cadwalader, responded to the sheriff's call for help. The troops faced little direct resistance, but they proved unable to stop people from starting new fires. On May 8th, mobs gutted several private dwellings, including Hugh Clark's home, a Catholic seminary, and 2 Catholic churches, St. Michael's at 2nd Street in Master and St. Augustine at 4th and Vine. Only a flood of new forces, including citizen posses, I don't know if that says including citizen posses, city police militia companies arriving from other cities, and U.S. Army and Navy troops ended the violence by May 10th. The city remained superficially calm for the next 8 weeks, but both nativists and Catholics anticipated further violence. In Southwark, an independent district south of Philadelphia, and a seat of nativist strength, a Catholic priest's brother began stockpiling weapons in the basement of the Church of St. Philip de Neri on Queen Street. On Friday, July 5th, a crowd of thousands gathered to demand the weapons. When the crowd reassembled the following day, the sheriff requested militia troops, and Cadwallader led about 200 into Southwark. Saturday ended without bloodshed, but the situation remained tense, with a small group of militia, some of them Irish Catholics themselves, guarding the church, and a group of nativist prisoners inside of it. On Sunday, July 7th, the crowd reassembled, and this time it armed itself with a cannon. Egged on by nativist speakers, the crowd forced the militia to surrender the church and its prisoners. Cadwallader returned to Southwark about sunset at the head of a column and tried to clear the area around the church. When the crowd attacked the militia with bricks, stones, and bottles, the militia fired on them, killing at least 2 and wounding more. Starting around 9 p.m., the crowd counterattacked. For the next 4 hours, rioters and militia battled in the streets of Southwark, with both sides firing cannon. By morning, 4 militiamen and probably a dozen rioters were dead, along with many more wounded. Southwark's aldermen negotiated the militia's withdrawal from their district, but thousands of militia troops from the other parts of the state arrived to patrol the city of Philadelphia. Although American cities, particularly Philadelphia, had endured a surge of riots since the early 1830s, few individual riots lasted for more than a day, making the 1844 riots extreme in their severity and duration. While some of the violence had been spontaneous, the ambitions of the nativist newspapers and political party in an election year likely sustained nativist fury through the spring and summer. Though the riots were more than the simple transplantation of anti-Catholic violence from Northern Ireland, they echoed the deliberate provocation seen there. The riots did not resolve the place of Irish in the city. On the one hand, few Philadelphians were willing to endorse publicly the attacks on Catholics, and more than 2,000 Philadelphians signed an address praising the militia's use of lawful force, which unlawful force made necessary. On the other hand, in the October elections, amid the heaviest turnout in Philadelphia's history, Levin and another nativist won congressional seats, and other nativists took lesser posts. Meanwhile, Philadelphians began discussing plans for a stronger police force to deter future riots. In April 1845, the legislature passed a law requiring each major city and district of Philadelphia County to support at least 1 police officer for every 150 taxable inhabitants. And in 1850, it created a new Philadelphia Police District to cover the entire metropolitan area, including the outlying districts of Kensington and Southwark. Though not the sole cause, these steps contributed to the consolidation of Philadelphia County into a single government in 1854. So that was the end of that. So a summary of it: in May and July, Philadelphia suffered some of the bloodiest rioting of the antebellum period as anti-immigrant mobs attacked Irish American homes and Roman Catholic churches before being suppressed by the militia. The violence was part of a wave of riots that convulsed American cities starting in the late 1830s. So they were not friends. And when I was looking for some of the images to put into this, and I came across some images of the Know Nothing Party and their issues again. And from what I do remember, what we did read on the Know Nothing Party is that showed as well the same principle that the Protestants hated the Catholics. So the main point is here to understand that the Protestants and the Catholics were not friends, and they are not friends today. So these images were all by Thomas Nast. He pioneered political cartoons in America. He was born in 1840 and he died in 1902. And here are a couple of his political cartoons from that time period. So remember, we're covering the time period from 1863 to around 1900. This is what he is representing, October 1, 1870. So we're within that time frame. This is a representation of the Pope of Rome, surrounded by his men and his army, gleefully pointing across the Atlantic towards the United States. It's titled The Promised Land, as seen from the dome of St. Peter's in Rome. So what's the fear in Protestant America when you have this Catholic threat? They believe there is a legitimate conspiracy from the Vatican itself to take over Protestant America. This was not the fear of the Millerites. This was the fear of the Protestants. And from some of the documents that we've been reading as well, what we've been learning is how quickly, actually before they even came to America, how the Protestants were quickly right there in Scotland, beginning with the Covenanters and the Reformed Presbyterian Church, were, from the way I remember reading it, it's as if they were anxious to take over the role of the Catholic Church. As the Catholic Church was going to decline in 1798, receive a deadly wound, the Protestants seemed to want to take the place of the prestige of the Catholic Church, of a union of church and state, where the church controls the state, and where there becomes, the result of that, the spirit of intolerance and persecution. And they didn't seem to hide the fact that that's what they were doing either. So here's another one. This one is from the year after in 1871. It shows the connection between those who come to the United States. Instead of integrating into the United States, they were never to be considered true Americans because they are tied to the apron strings of the Pope of Rome. Again, the fear is the fear of a conspiracy. So you can see he's tied to the apron strings of the Pope of Rome. This one is particularly famous. This is 1875, and if you look at the Capitol in the background, it's been overtaken by the Catholic Church. It says political church. Towards the right, it says political Roman Catholic Church, and then it shows bishops as alligators coming for America's school children, and their fear is about what would be taught in American public schools. Similarly, again, with the idea of conspiracy, this is all political cartoons in that history. Again, the threat of an infiltrating Roman Catholicism with a secret ear into both political parties, hiding under the curtain of religion with a deep-set conspiracy to infiltrate American politics and ruling America. So Protestants feared Catholicism coming in to take over America. Again, Rome coming for America's school system. This is the Catholic threat that Protestants are facing in 1888. Now, they're not doing political cartoons about Adventism, so as they give homage to the papacy through the Blair Bill, who do they hate more, Catholics or Seventh-day Adventists? It was not us. And if you think this ended quickly, you should come to the cartoons of 1920. This is a cartoon. Thomas Nast is dead by now, but using the Holy Bible, a true American Protestant has taken down the Catholic threat. Now you'll notice something especially unique about this true American Protestant. What's this crusader wearing? Now, when it comes to the 1920s, the true Protestant defenders against Catholicism were the Ku Klux Klan, and that is represented by many of the political photos of that time. And here's my final example. This extended for a long period of American history. Here's the evil demonic hand of Rome reaching out for the United States, about to be beaten down by the Klansmen. So that's extending out of our history and heading into 1910, 1920, 1930. I just wanted to illustrate it didn't end in the 19th century. It's certainly in full force in 1888. And what strikes fear in the heart of many Protestants, it's not Adventism, It's the conspiracy theory of a deliberately infiltrating Rome. I'm going to say it again. Where does the threat come from in America? Protestantism. So why do Adventists think like Protestants? Walter Reith has invented nothing new. He's just taken all the Protestant conspiracy theories and made them look new, look like they're uniquely Adventist, and they're not. So the threat was free thinkers, Jews, Adventists, and Catholics. So that first history from 1863 to 1900, it was the free thinkers, the Jews, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Catholics. So while they hate Catholics, how can they pay homage to Catholicism? In 2018, during that first series in Arkansas, we went to 1893 and the World's Fair. As Protestants tried to enforce Sunday keeping at the World's Fair, Seventh-day Adventists started a new association called International Religious Liberty Association. They wrote a tract against that enactment of Sunday, and one of those tracts ended up in the hands of a Catholic in Baltimore. What the Catholic Church in Baltimore did was publish for editorials that appeared in the Catholic Mirror, and that's the one I just talked about a little bit ago. Their publication on September 2nd, 9th, 16th, and 23rd. They're all in the Pioneer Writing. And I sent those out if you have trouble finding them in the Pioneer Writings. I had to kind of dig for them a little bit too. But I did send them out. And if you don't have them still and need them, let me know and I'll email it out again. So if you were to go to 1893 RCPKS 2.22, you'll find written out the 4 editorials in full. I'm going to tell you what the Catholic Church is saying to Protestantism, but you can read them. Through these 4 editorials, the Catholic Church proved that the Sabbath was never changed to Sunday in the New Testament, that Sunday keeping is purely an institution of the Roman Catholic Church. And then Catholicism looks to Protestantism and they openly mock them. They say, you hate us, you're threatened by us. In fact, you're desperately trying to change your constitution to show that no Catholic can be a true American. But every time you keep Sunday with no biblical evidence, you can do so. You honor us. So with mockery, if you read the not necessarily in the words, but in the tone of the articles, the Catholic Church was saying to Protestantism, thank you for your homage. Now, isn't that ironic? So in the Catholic Mirror, it says, they say, thank you for your homage. So the Catholic Church is making it plain. Not only did the Sabbath not change in the New Testament, it's completely their creation, but they're also saying that the Protestants are giving them homage. I'll use a worldly story. I'll assume you're all good Adventists. So if I was to say the name Julio Iglesias, none of you will know who I'm talking about. He's supposed to be one of the greatest Latin singers of all time. One of the greatest or the greatest Latin singers of all time. Now, what made Julio Iglesias very upset? He had a son, and his son had a really good voice, and the son began to sing, Enrique Iglesias. Now, what's the relationship between the father and the son? If I can be brutal, they hate each other. So father and son hate each other. The son hates his father, but where did the voice of the son come from? It's inherited. It's in his blood. So Enrique Iglesias, he stands up to sing. He hates his father. Does he have any desire to pay homage to his father? No. But every time he opens his mouth against his will, he's paying homage because he's showing where he came from. So they don't have to be friends to pay homage. Ellen White is saying it's in the act that the homage lays. You can have a woman who's a supermodel. She has a daughter that hates her famous mother, but the daughter is beautiful. So every time the daughter stands up and models, regardless of the hatred she holds for her mother, she pays homage. Because as Julio can say to Enrique, hate me all you like, your voice came from me. And the mother says to the daughter, hate me all you like, your appearance came from me. So homage doesn't mean that they're friends. And in 1893, Catholicism said to Protestantism, hate the mother all you like. Your Sunday keeping came from me. That is homage. You need to find no non-existent deep state conspiracy. You could read further down in the Great Controversy, 446, paragraph 1. Whoever knowingly keeps Sunday gives supreme honor and shows their mark of allegiance to the Pope of Rome. In 448, paragraph 3, this one's good. Romanists declare. So the Catholic Church declares, so the Romanists or the Catholic Church declares, the observance of Sunday by the Protestants is a homage they pay to Catholicism in spite of themselves. So we have these references where the Great Controversy is telling us, the Spirit of Prophecy is telling us that Protestants are paying homage by keeping Sunday, by the observance. It's an observance. And that they are paying homage to, Protestant is homage they pay to Catholicism in spite of themselves. So in spite of themselves, regardless of what they wanted to do, the very act is a homage. Hey, here. So the threat is the free thinkers. They want to control them through Sunday law. They can control them through Sunday law. This is their threats. They can control them through the Sunday law and through blasphemy. The Jews, you can control them through Sunday laws. And the Adventists, you can control them through Sunday laws. But on the Catholics, none of that is enough for Catholicism, because you have to amend the Constitution to state that it's a Protestant nation. And we read that in the A.T. Jones document as well on, I can't quite remember the title, but it was the one that was about the Supreme Court to call this nation a Protestant nation. So they had Sunday in there with the World's Fair, but they wanted to declare this a Protestant nation, not just a Christian nation, but a Protestant Christian nation, to distinctly separate themselves from Rome. In other words, we're in charge now, not you. So I want to move on to the second history now. We have a lot to get through with the second history. And I didn't put my lines in here for that, so I'm going to have to correct this later. But we'll look at the lines afterwards that I have on the board. But I'll correct the slideshow later. But to remember the key points: hated by Protestantism, persecuted and killed during the nativist riots. Protestantism feared the infiltration of the Jesuits in the Catholic Church, determined to protect themselves from Catholicism by declaring it to be a Protestant nation. But despite themselves, were paying homage. Despite what they willed to do, despite their hatred, Protestants pay homage to the papacy every time they keep Sunday. So the second history, the mid-20th century, it's in the 40s and 50s, Judeo-Christian nationalism. And what is the threat? I want to quote extensively from the book, The Evangelicals. So the first history was 1863 to 1900s. You had the free thinkers, you control them through Sunday laws. The Jews control them through the Sunday laws. The Seventh-day Adventists, you control them through the Sunday laws. And the Catholics, they needed to amend the Constitution to make us a Protestant nation. So now we're in the late 40s and the 50s. I say 1950s, but it really goes back to the late 1940s. Many of you now have access to the book, The Evangelicals. I'd like to recommend especially chapters 5 to 7. It covers much of this history. Through the early 20th century, there was a war in Protestant churches. We've spoken of it before. It's known as the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Many people thought that the modernists had won and fundamentalists or fundamentalism had died. So back on if you think about the board that I showed you, we'll go back there at the end of this, where you had the First Great Awakening, you had the old side, new side, and it was an issue between liberal and conservatism. And then you had 1798 to 1844, where you had the old school versus new school. So in the 40s and 50s in here, prior to this history here, you had the fundamentalist modernist controversy. So again, you're going to have conservatism and liberalism controversy. Many people thought that the modernists had won and fundamentalists or fundamentalism had died. It seemed that fundamentalism had lost that fight, had been humiliated, but fundamentalism lived on. It's remarkably resilient, particularly through Bible institutes such as the Moody Bible Institute and conservative colleges such as Wheaton College and Bob Jones University. 2.5 decades after the humiliation of fundamentalism, it began to resurrect in the person of a young fundamentalist known as Billy Graham. Now, through those 2.5 decades, the 20s, 30s, and the 40s, fundamentalism had been seen as more and more extreme. The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald. Throughout the 1920s, Frank Norris maintained that the Catholics were attempting to take over the government and overturn the Constitution. And we were reading some of this. I don't think we got this far, but or might have touched on some of this in what we were reading. We'll return to that another day as well. So there's still a fear of Catholicism. So throughout the 1920s, Frank Norris maintained that the Catholics were attempting to take over the government and overturn the Constitution. So there's that fear of Catholicism in each history. The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald. If that happened, he wrote, they would behead every Protestant preacher and disembowel every Protestant mother. They would burn to ashes every Protestant church and dynamite every Protestant school. So they fear the Catholics. So in the next paragraph, in the early 1930s, a number of leaders, among them Arnold Gablin, James M. Gray, William B. Riley, and Gerald Windward, embraced the notorious forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and integrated it into the end time scenarios uncomfortably as it set with their prophetic Zionism. These are all leading fundamentalists of that time. So Arnold, Gablin, James Gray, Riley, and Windward, all leading fundamentalists at that time. This is just prior to Billy Graham. According to Riley, a Jewish communist cabal was secretly plotting to establish a one world government to impose a uniform atheistic religion on the enslaved populations of the world. So they see, like I was saying earlier with the Great Depression and then the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt bringing in the New Deal, they saw it as socialism or communism coming in to take over the government and form this one world government to impose uniform atheistic religion. So while you have the Democrats that are against uniting church and state, they're viewed, if you remember through those histories, they're viewed as godless and atheistic. So this is just an early Walter White. He has no new message, but whatever he would have, conservative Protestantism believe it's not a message he's taken from the Great Controversy. So nowhere in the Great Controversy does it tell us that it's going to be this one world government to impose a uniform atheistic religion to enslave the populations of the world. And I thought it was interesting. I've been listening to the reunion presentations as well. And review is always good, but when Babylon came in ancient Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, there was a siege and then a destruction of Jerusalem, and they're carried away to Babylon. And then in 70 AD, there's a siege and then there's the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't know if they're carried away there. I don't recall them being carried away there. There's a destruction, but they're controlled. But anyways, there's destruction in 70 AD. So that's the first and second history. You're going to have a third history where there's a siege, and then they're destroyed and carried into Babylon. So because you would take those characteristics and apply it to our day, carried into Babylon. So at the Sunday law, you have the siege, and then the Sunday law is the destruction of the United States, and they're taken into captivity to Babylon. So Riley and Windward, who led the defenders of the Christian faith, maintained that apostate Jews were already taking over American finances. ports and newspapers, and as Riley put it, making ready to filch the land of all its gold, take over its cattle and its farms, and possess themselves of all its factories, arts, and industries. This is the history of the Great Depression. In comes Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Roosevelt is a socialist because he brings in the New Deal as a response to the Great Depression. So those and other fundamentalist leaders, this is back from the evangelicals, so those and the other fundamentalist leaders charged that the New Deal was preparing the way for the Antichrist and pointed to the Blue Eagle insignia of the National Recovery Administration as the mark of the beast. So that's out of the book, The Evangelicals. So you know they're evil because there's this blue eagle and they're telling you in secret the methodology of Walter Reich. Quoting again from the Evangelicals, the Roosevelt administration, Riley wrote, was clearly a Jewish-controlled regime. So they believed that Eleanor was a socialist and believed the administration was composed of secret Stalinists and communist sympathizers. Some of these fundamentalist leaders became Nazi sympathizers. Hitler, Riley wrote, has snatched his country from the very jaws of atheistic communism with help from on high. They're Nazi sympathizers, these fundamentalists. So fundamentalism was not doing very well. Finally, in the late 1940s, a revivalist is going to change that story. Billy Graham, he's going to change the idea of Christian that has now become tainted through these fundamentalists. And now it'll go from Christian to Judeo-Christian. So Christian to Judeo-Christian to separate themselves from fascism. And fundamentalists will get changed to evangelical. So like a business that goes bankrupt, they reinvent themselves, give themselves a new name, but they're the same people. Just like you saw the Reformed Presbyterian Church, the Covenanters, the National Reform Association, the fundamentalists, and the evangelicals. They're the same people all the way through that see this nation to be a white Christian nation and God is our King. Christ is our King. So in our next study, we'll pick up from here and complete the history of the 50s and give some history of Billy Graham. And we'll briefly summarize. So in the late 1940s to 50s, you went from Christian to Judeo-Christian, you went from fundamentalist to evangelical. We want to know how the papacy is giving homage, how the papacy is given homage, that should be given, not giving, given homage at the Sunday law. In over 126 years, Adventism has kneaded into its message the worldview, this 126 years here, the conspiracy theories of Protestantism, the fear of a secret Catholic plot, Jewish and Catholic infiltration, secret plans for a one world government, Jews controlling the banking system, your ability to see all this because of the insignia and the signs that they show you, socialism as Satanism, capitalism as purity. So, and this went back to socialism, goes back to the old school, new school, and where they had the social gospel and was more about helping people as opposed to the conservatives thinking people have to pull up themselves by their bootstraps, and while they actually create circumstances to suppress and oppress people that they can't ever get themselves pulled back up. All of these are Protestant ideas that have infiltrated Adventism. If you read the Great Controversy carefully, she will tell you that they were paying homage in 1888 against their will. This document does not conflict with the Great Controversy when it identifies Catholicism as one of the greatest threats Protestantism faced in their own mind. And everything Protestantism was attempting to do was not to pay homage, but to put their foot on the neck of that frightening Catholic infiltration. If we understand that history correctly, we won't take those conspiracy theories that incorrect worldview to the Sunday law in our time and look for friendship between Francis and the Republican Party. So the next study, we'll look at Billy Graham. And I have that one partway done. So we can go back to the board. Let me pull it back out just a little bit. Things quieted down a little bit for now. We'll see if it stays that way. Okay, watch out, guys. Watch out. Watch out. We don't have a lot of space in this room. Okay, so this is what you can see it, right? See it okay?
Yes.
Okay, so just going back to what we just read and what we reviewed just a little bit ago, where you had the First Great Awakening in the 1700s, where the issue was the old side versus the new side. And we traced that back all the way back to Calvinism. John Knox taking Calvinism back to Scotland. And we've read some of those documents in that. We've seen the documents by A.T. Jones saying that, proving that the National Reform Association that's formed here is the Reformed Presbyterian Church are the Covenanters. They're all the same people. And what we just saw in this history, in here you have the modernist fundamentalist movement, and then fundamentalism then is going to change here in our history too, or in here to evangelicalism. So so you have the old school versus the new school, and then you have the modernist. This is the modernist versus the fundamentalist here in this history here. And this was here in 1888 when you have the Sunday law, and then I think we just read the date, but I think it was 1891, maybe somebody remembers the date, for the Chicago World's Fair. But what they had wanted to do was to amend the Constitution. We reviewed that at the beginning, that they wanted to amend the Constitution to make this a Protestant nation, a Protestant Christian. It's a Christian nation, but they wanted to make sure they specified it was a Protestant Christian nation to completely separate itself from Catholicism. So the Sunday law issue took care of the Jews, took care of the free thinkers, took care of the Seventh-day Adventists, but the with Catholicism, you had to amend the Constitution. So that's the first history that we just went through. So, and then you come to this, you go through this history in the book, The Evangelicals. It'll go through that modernist versus the fundamentalists, and then the fundamentalism appeared to have died, but then it resurrects in the man of Billy Graham, and Billy Graham brings it in here. So you have in here after the dates, after the Depression, 1929, you have Roosevelt bring in the New Deal, and they're fearing that socialism and communism is coming in, and they have this threat, and they mobilize again, and then you have Billy Graham that appears on the scene. So then you have this history here that we're going to look at next time, Billy Graham, where it's fundamentalism that becomes evangelicalism. Any questions or comments? That was actually kind of a short study.
Yeah.
Yeah, great review.
Is everybody kind of getting it a little bit better?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's three structures: God's people, the Adventist Church, modern Israel. There's the counterfeit, which is the papacy. There's Protestantism, which is the In God We Trust movement. In each of those histories, in 1863 to the 1900s, back to the Civil War, when they first printed In God We Trust on the coins, they are saying that we've got to do this to put God back in, get God in the government, because the Civil War is a judgment from God for not having God in the government in this nation. We trace that all the way back to the Covenanters, Reformed Presbyterian Church, of believing that Christ is King of this earth, King of the United States, and that they are the true church to enforce their morality on the world. And so you have those three structures, and you have the three histories: the history of the Millerites, the 1888 history, both histories of failure, and then our history is a history of success. The counterfeit you have from 1899 to 1945, the end of World War II, the history of failure. And then you have 1979, I think it is, 1989, with the war between Jesuits and John Paul II, and that ends in failure as well. And then you have the history of success that begins with I always forget where she marks it in 2001, but if somebody remembers the details of why she marks it 2001, I need that part to stick in my head, because I always forget why, because we know that they weren't there at the time. So who remembers the event in 2001 that she's marking Francis and Benedict? I knew you knew it, David.
Well, because it was the same thing with you. I couldn't remember what it was. I knew it was 2001. So at 2001, Bergoglio, which is Francis, right? He's the Pope now. He becomes a cardinal, and he has to become a cardinal before he can be put on the docket to become an actual Pope. And so she's marking it the way I understood it, because that's when he, starts his march towards being a Pope.
Okay.
And I think there's more to that, of course, but that was kind of the basics of it.
Yeah, that's one that's not stuck in my head for some reason.
Yeah.
So, and then we have the history of Protestantism. I think I just reviewed the other two. So then we have the history of Protestantism, 1863 to the 1900s. Then you have the 1888 issue go on in there, and all the arguments by A.T. Jones. And then and what we found was really interesting in reading those articles by A.T. Jones is how clear the issue was. And we ran across and read a couple of different quotes where Ellen White actually links the National Reform Movement to the third angel's message, in saying that we're not paying attention. The church was not paying attention to the National Reform Movement as they should have. And that it was, and she relates it to the third angel's message, and that being in that 1888 history. So then you have the 40s and 50s, which is where you're going to transition from the fundamentalists to the evangelicals, and the history of Billy Graham. And we'll go through that, and I'll get those notes done for, I think it's next week now, right, Christine?
Yes, next Wednesday.
Okay. So that's all I have. And I guess what we could do is read some more of the evangelicals, if you guys want to do that. Yes, Nora, maybe.
Yes, that would be good. I do have one question.
Sure.
It looks like a waymark, but it's World War I or World War II, excuse me, on your line there before the 40s to 50s. But we've got social gospel, BS capitalism. So could you fill that in just a little bit with?
Oh yeah, those are just some notes I kind of added there for just looking at that. The social gospel versus capitalism is kind of what they start to link here. But back here, they always had, the issue was over a social gospel of helping people, as opposed to, I don't know, the conservatives, the issue, I'm going to probably say this wrong, but the issue is always wanting to conserve and hold on to what they have, and they're not about helping people. So there was.
You say back at the, in the Second Great Awakening.
Yeah.
It was socialism. Or
Well, it
helping
was
people.
socialism, but it was considered a social gospel. And you'll see that in the book, The Evangelicals, we talk about it a lot. So when it comes to the old school, new school, it was a social gospel. And that's the history that Ellen White was then going to Casco Street eventually and hearing the Millerite messages, Miller's messages. And so you had the old school that, like as if we were to look at Trump today and the Republican Party today, you had the old school, and those that did not come out of the old school into when the new school comes along and is about, you know, they don't have everything right, but they're about more about helping people and social services to help people. And what we see today is, you know, they view that as, well, you're just going to tax all our money away so that, you know, people can be freeloaders. So you had this social gospel issue versus capitalism eventually develops in here after the Great Depression and the New Deal. So that's kind of why I put it there. Was I don't know that you can call it capitalism back there, but it merges into capitalism here. That's an area that I'm not that not that wise on or smart on.
That was developing around the World War II period, capitalism.
Yeah, yeah. Because when during the Great Depression, when Roosevelt brought in the New Deal to help recover from the Great Depression, they saw that as socialism creeping in and communism creeping in.
Right.
And so they viewed that as a threat. And so as a result of that, they started to link God to capitalism and money and wealth and success, which eventually brought you to your health. What are your pastors today that are going to make you rich? The only ones that are rich are them, it seems.
Yeah, gotcha.
Because they take the money from everybody. So yeah, did that help?
Yeah, that did.
Okay.
Yeah, I just hear because we're seeing that now in our time.
Yeah.
And there is a counter to that. And let me say this correctly. The threat seems to be in a conspiracy theory that China is, it's the threat to, I'm talking about democracy. That, I don't know if you've heard this, but it's really playing a big part with people's thinking that China's buying up everything in America and they're the ones that are going to collapse America.
Yeah, it's all part of the same conspiracy theories that far right believes in, and they're all, and Adventism is right along with them. It's basically standing on the railroad tracks looking the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, but it sounds so true of what, it sounds legitimate. Like, okay, China's buying up property here, all these things, and they own everything, and we'll just be their slaves.
Until you understand this history.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So Adventism can understand this, which most of them will not accept this history until they can understand this history. Walter White's conspiracy theories are gonna continue to seem real to them.
Yeah.
And they're looking at the wrong threat when they don't see Protestantism as the threat.
Exactly.
They see the New World Order as their threat.
Absolutely. Yep.
So
That's
back
true.
in that time of old school versus new school, and you have William Miller in here, the people that were in the old school, or like in the Republican Party today, those ones that are staunch Trump supporters, those people are locked in and they're not leaving. And so then you, just like with us internally, we had to transition out of that conservative mindset, right? So
Right.
you had people that, when the new school came in, you had people that they were revivals, and they brought people out of that old school and into the new school. But the people that would not give up the religion of their fathers and all their doctrine and all their beliefs and such, they stayed in the old school. So those that came into the new school, I kind of worded it this way to my son in a message this morning, not relating to, sort of tying in, without telling them what we're learning, but stuff he is actually recognizing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That they have to have made a transition from the new school to the Millerite movement.
Right.
And so you have the same thing in our history with us in here in this history here, that the external events are doing a work to cause people. Yeah, I still say this about Donald Trump. He didn't create the circumstances. I mean, that's been the work that's been going on. Look down here. That's been a work that's been going on for a long time to create the right circumstances for him to come in. And he brings out the hatred that's already in people's hearts, that's hidden, and brings it out.
Yeah.
So that was already there. But people that stayed within that mindset are not coming out. And then they have to then transition to the, come out of there and transition. I think what I started to say is how Trump every day seemed to be more radical and more bizarre and more crazy. And it was, to me, I always pictured it in my head like Pharaoh going to Moses and saying, let my people go. And the plagues were falling down and everything kept getting worse and worse and worse. So you'd see this behavior out of Trump is like, wow, are you guys going to continue to support that man? And then the next day would be something even worse, and they just defend him even more and more and more. They
Yes.
dug their heels in. They were not leaving. So you see those ones that did come out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in God's kingdom. They have to be able to recognize God's kingdom. So out there amongst all these people are people that truly do love God, but do not know these things. But these events and this parable, because that's what it really is playing out
Right.
in a parabolic way to, because what is the many different ways to look at parables, right? But compare and contrast, right? Bring two things close together.
Mhm.
So this history that we're in has brought these things close together. When they were far apart, you couldn't see the problems.
That's right.
But as they come together, like close together like this, you can now see and compare and contrast the problems. So those events are causing people to be able to see how terrible, the Republican Party is. And to have what happened today with Liz Cheney, and have her say what she said, that this is going to destroy the Republican Party and possibly this nation. That's exactly where they're headed, is to that destruction. So what's interesting is what I've got on my mind is like, that doesn't have Sunday law on it. This doesn't have Sunday law on it either. But at Sunday law, you have shipwreck, right?
Hmm.
And that's the fall of the United States.
The institution.
Yeah, the institution. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll get more light on that down the road.
Yes.
But we see here in his history here, after this Judeo-Christian, embracing Jews, and the Judeo-Christian movement to go from fundamentalism to evangelicals, and you have capitalism now against communism and socialism. Because that's what you see. I mean, I see it all over in Facebook and articles, and how these people are so afraid that the government's going to take all our money to help all these lazy people that don't want to work. Even the issue over the unemployment benefits, that's part of that. Unemployment, giving people all this extra unemployment is making them lazy. They'd rather stay home and collect unemployment than go to work. So there's not enough workers now. So, I mean, all the, they're totally against helping people. And where does helping people, I don't know how to ask the question. Where does helping people, maybe you'll get what I'm trying to say, originate from? I don't know if I asked that question right, but
Jesus.
Right.
Yeah. It's
And
serving
these are people
others.
that call themselves Christians and Seventh-day Adventists that are totally against helping people. And they don't see it because they'll go do good deeds. They'll go do some good deeds and help some people here and there and go do missionary trips or what have you. But they'll spread their version of things. And their version of things is to hate immigrants and to hate those that need our help. When you look at the, and we talked about this, I think last week or whenever recently, those that are coming up from across the border, and you guys have pointed out it wasn't just Mexico, it's further south. They're coming up,
South America.
yeah, from South America. They're coming up to escape persecution and oppression and violence and rape and everything else that you can think of, and poverty. And they're trying to come here, right? And what do we have? This mixture in the United States of those that say, nope, this is our nation, get out of here. You know, go work out your own problems. Instead of helping, which is what God wanted this nation to be, to help
Yeah.
all people.
Yeah, well, and Trump turned it into more nationalistic, where the border, was going to keep everybody out of here,
Yeah,
and spending, money, taxpayer money for this wall, and just block them so they can't come in here.
right.
I mean, I do see Biden trying to do something with this, but, he inherited most of this.
Yeah.
And, yeah,
When you think about it, but if you pull back the scope on it and look from the bigger picture, I don't know if this is right to say it this way, but it's like they're never going to fix it
no,
because you're so divided. You're never going to fix it because when one party has their turn, they do their thing, and then the other party gets their turn, and they do their thing and undo what the other one did. So
yes,
you never fix anything.
exactly.
So it's just
And-
for power and
Well, and it's done a lot too for just trying to be reelected again.
right.
I mean, that would help if they were able to carry on a work that would be helping others
Right.
to be reelected. But you have to both parties have to cooperate to
So
see the good, to
David
see
has his
that
hand up.
good, that won't happen
what, Christine?
with
Oh, I'm sorry.
conservatives. Sorry.
David
Saying
has
because
his
they're
hand up too.
fighting against one another.
Yeah. Christine, were you going to say something? No?
David has his hand up.
Yeah, I actually did. Well, just on that part of the subject, but I wanted to go back to that capitalism for a second. But on that subject, they sent Kamala Harris kind of, I don't know physically, but virtually down to try and help solve out some of these problems with all the immigrants coming, because it's a problem down there. Yeah, we can help whoever gets up here probably, but it's systemically a problem outside of our country that, it's just out of control. It's snowballed so bad. The world's crumbling, and people are just trying to jump on the ark of the USA, and you can't blame them for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I know Kamala was sent to try and see if she could solve problems in these other countries for the people. Why they have it so terrible, kind of thing, which, yeah, it'd be great if the Republicans and Democrats could get together and try and solve this, but I really don't think that they can solve it. It's
No,
a
not at this
worldwide problem. Yeah, there's people
definitely.
coming from like current way over across the sea, Africa and all these places. They get over to South America and then they come up through Panama. And I saw this thing about this 50 some mile trip that they have to go through Panama through the jungle, and it's a survival thing, and people are dying out there all the time. If you twist your ankle, you're not going to make it. You're going to die out there. And they showed actually they had skeletons and stuff. People that this lady did this whole thing, and she walked this thing with these people and all. And they're coming from all over the world, trying to come up that way up into finally get up to us. And it's just heartbreaking to see all this going on.
I saw some of that.
But my,
Mm,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Well,
just so heartbreaking.
my reason I raised my hand was about the capitalists, because it's interesting. I actually did this one that Christine's going to do, I think next week, from Tess. And it's more of the 50s, the 40s and 50s, and then the current, the 79 up, right? And so Tess has capitalism as one of the bullet points for under the 40s and 50s there.
Yeah.
And so I didn't understand what it was all about. And I see, you're helping me a little bit, because about the time in the 40s and 50s about capitalism and how our country had fully bloomed into it. But I had done a little just short look into that to see what it was. And if you don't mind me, I can read like maybe 2 little paragraphs here.
Yeah, go ahead.
And one's from a short story of American capitalism by this Meyer Weinberg. And he just basically gives us like a definition of capitalism. He says, in short, capitalism can be caused by, and the very first thing he mentions is inequality. I thought that was interesting. But it's also market failure, damage to the environment, short-termism, excess materialism, and boom and bust economic cycles. All these things are under that heading of capitalism. And we can see all those things when you think about short-termism and the damage to the environment and those kinds of things. Because the bottom line with this whole thing is, and I thought it was really interesting about Christianity, how it ties in. It says, a new turn in Christian doctrine contributed to the quest to prove one's salvation because God's favor could be shown through business success. And that's from another book, Protestantism and Capitalism, the Mechanics of Influence by Jerry Cohen. But yeah, it was just really a whole different thing. But just to put a time frame on it, this is not the 40s and 50s. This is like in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By 1900, he says that the American economy became predominantly capitalistic only by 1900. And, it was recognized a lot of places. There's this German guy, his name is Werner Sombart, and he says in 1906 that America is the Cana of capitalism. It's the promised land, he writes. You can just see that these people from other places really see what's going on over here, whether they agree with it or not. I'm not really sure about that, but they're seeing what's going on. And the other guy, William Parker, says the tendencies of Western capitalism could find its fullest and most uncontrolled expression in the United States. So it just went wild over here and, took over people. But interestingly, I'll finish with this little thing here. It says, American capitalists had almost a free hand in gaining control of a country unimaginably rich in natural resources. We know that. In straight out contests of strength and both organized and unorganized workers, American capitalists usually triumphed. State violence, judge-made law, compliant legislators, and administrative procedures were arrayed effectively against challenges from below, or anybody that was going to challenge it. A political process whereby the economic power can become translated into, get this, governmental policy.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's all just deep into it, yeah. But that thing about the
Ingrained.
Christianity, and it's ingrained, how they were proving they were Christians because God's favor was on them if they made a lot of money. And it didn't matter if you wrecked the economy or anything like that and put in all this inequality and the market failures and the bust and boom cycles, that didn't matter. It was all about, proving that we were okay with God because we made a lot of money. So anyways, that was like early, like 1900, 1906, those kind of guys were all in on this stuff. So, like Tess says, nothing happens in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's all through the Industrial Revolution years. you know, when
Yeah.
this nation was growing, industrialized.
Yeah.
With Rockefeller and all these big, you know, and yeah, these people
Yeah. They
became
were.
very wealthy, building this country. Thank you so much for
Yeah, thank you
sharing
for
that, David.
Well, I only had it because I had to do a thing over here, and that's what I had picked on. I can't wait to see Christina's next week, or Christine's.
It all fits together.
So wait a
Yeah,
second.
it does.
What am I doing? Because I'm not sure I'm
I
doing.
thought you were doing.
What?
Oh, well, I thought you were doing the 1950s, taking off from the 1940s and 50s
I'm doing
one.
The,
Oh, you're doing it.
the presentation about Billy Graham.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
that-
okay. Yeah.
You're
Elaine.
doing that,
Yeah.
Elaine?
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's me next week.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
The Crusade of Billy Graham.
Yeah.
Okay, I got that all mixed up there. I'm half out of it, laying on the couch here, and then all of a sudden I perk up when you start talking about those things. I'm like, hey, wait a minute.
If I can get it done in time. If I don't get it done in time, we'll continue reading the evangelicals, but I'm going to work real hard at getting it done on time.
Are we
Yeah.
gonna do the
Yeah.
evangelicals on Friday?
We can do that, yeah.
Okay,
'Cause we
cool.
don't have anything going on Friday, right?
Correct.
Yeah, we can do that, because I don't know how far we are into chapter, I think we started at chapter 4. I'll pull it up.
Yeah.
now.
We started at chapter 4. I have the page written down somewhere.
Yeah, I have it right here. I had it marked
Okay.
where we were at. And I know that we were having trouble with this chapter. I know I was. This is that history. You guys can still see the board?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
This is that history in here of the issue between the modernists and the fundamentalists. And where fundamentalism seemed to die
Actually,
off.
I think we're looking at the evangelicals. You're sharing the document.
Yeah, this is the book, The Evangelicals. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Oh, were you able to see the board, did you say?
Yeah, I was looking at screen number 1 instead of
okay.
screen number 2.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Cool.
I did put the book up there.
Cool.
I thought you were talking about the history of the evangelicals. No, but the book, The Evangelicals, yeah. So I think this is where we were at. If you wrote down a page number, I might have highlighted that just because of what it said. Do you have a page number that you wrote down?
I'm sure I do. I think.
I'm pretty sure
So
that-
we stopped at the top of page 108.
Okay, yeah, then that's
Yep.
where we're at right here.
Yep.
Okay, so the Bible school men, on the other hand, turns to nationalism and isolationism, parting company, not just with the liberals, but with their own pre-war pacifism and Tories' law of love among nations. Okay, so in 1919, James Gray called the pressure to join the new League of Nations, the third greatest crisis in American history. By then, most premillennialists had decided the League would be the precursor to a revived Roman Empire, and that non-participation would make it easier on the United States when Christ returned to judge the Gentile nations. And we talked about this, I think, last week. Christina's with us too, because she can help me maybe with when we were talking about the EU is like the same thing as what they did with the League of Nations, which later became the United Nations. But the fundamentalists the fundamentalists didn't want it. They just wanted to be their white Christian nation and keep out who they wanted to keep out and keep to themselves and only look after themselves and not be involved with other nations. So they didn't want to be involved with other nations. So by then, most the premillennialists had decided the League would be the precursor to a revived Roman Empire. So they're against it. And that non-participation would make it easier on the United States when Christ returned to judge the Gentile nations. But Gray's objections were not entirely on theological grounds. In an issue of the Moody Bible Institute's Christian Workers magazine, he wrote that for America to join the League would be national suicide, and referred readers to the tracts of the secular lobby, which portrayed the League as incompatible with the fundamentals of American independence. Then, rather than counsel prayer that God's will be done, Gray and his fellow premillennialists called upon Christians to oppose American participation in the League, and because war was inevitable, to resist the disarmament of the United States. The premillennialist call to unilateralism seemed to fly the face of their doctrinal fatalism, but as Marsden explains, the premillennialists were also heirs to the Puritan assumption of responsibility for the country, and the tension between their two commitments remained an ever-present paradox in their thinking. The tension, however, often seemed to resolve itself on more or less pragmatic grounds and in terms of the dominant sentiment in their constituencies. For example, premillennial revivalists, such as Billy Sunday, actively opposed drinking and gambling, whereas the stay-at-home theoreticians tended to be fatalistic about the decline of American morals. During World War I, premillennialists oscillated between fatalistic withdrawal and activism, along with the rest of the country, and in opposing the League, they were hardly alone. When Wilson failed to persuade European leaders to accept his views of a just peace, an isolationist reaction to foreign entanglement set in. And in March 1920, the US Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. In any case, from that time on, militant nationalism and hostility toward international organizations became the approach of millenarian fundamentalists in their activist mode. So they rejected the League of Nations in that history and wanted to isolate the nation as opposed to being involved in other nations. So World War I was hardly the disaster for the United States that it was for Europe. All the same, more than 53,000 American soldiers had died, and the national mobilization for war had so dislocated the American economy that in the immediate post-war period, there was widespread unemployment and bitter industrial strife. In 1919 and 1920, a wave of strikes and lockouts involving over 4 million workers shut down almost every industry, from steel to textiles to the railroads. Employers charged that anarchy was taking over and launched a national union busting campaign. Most of the major strikes were called by the conservative American Federation of Labor, but radicals were involved in some of them and fired up by wartime propaganda. The press and much of the public attributed all of them to anarchists and Bolsheviks. After May Day riots in several large cities and a spate of anarchist bombings, many Americans believed that an organized attack against the government and capitalism was underway. The wartime fears about Bolshevism erupted into a Red Scare and a hunt for left-wingers and foreigners with radical ideas. A number of states passed anti-sedition laws, and in December 1919, the U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a series of lawless raids, arresting several thousand resident aliens and jailing or deporting many of them. Such was the hysteria that when a distinguished Methodist bishop led a commission of inquiry into a steel strike, he was harassed and called a Bolshevik, even by members of his own church. In November 1920, an almost unknown Republican Senator, Warren G. Harding of Ohio, was elected president with 61% of the vote, the largest landslide in American history to that date. The Red Scare ended, but a nativist reaction took its place. In 1921, the Congress passed a law limiting the number of aliens admitted annually to 3% of the foreign-born in the United States, based on the 1910 census. 3 years later, a still more stringent law virtually ended immigration from anywhere except Northern Europe. Meanwhile, the Ku Klux Klan, revived by an erstwhile Protestant preacher, broadened its targets from African Americans to Catholics and Jews. We saw that in the cartoon that she had put together to look at in that history. Recruiting in the small towns of the North and the South, the Klan at its peak in 1923 had 3 million members and political power in half a dozen states. What was left of the reforming instincts of American Protestantism, went into the passage of 2 constitutional amendments, the 18th banning the sale of alcoholic beverages, and the 19th giving women the right to vote. Prohibition was seen as a reform by most Protestant denominations, but it was also a part of the reaction against Catholics, immigrants, and labor unions. Billy Sunday, who always knew what his conservative and increasingly small town audiences wanted to hear, cheered on the Palmer raids, boosted the anti-immigration laws, and worked for prohibition, all with equal enthusiasm, and all in the name of restoring pure Americanism. In this period, Bible school and denominational fundamentalists abandoned the defensive and essentially conservative position represented in the fundamentals for the militant anti-modernism that characterized the fundamentalist movement from then on. Beginning in 1918, they went from more or less peaceful coexistence with the liberals in their denominations to organized efforts to drive modernism out of the churches and schools. The war had turned them into activists, and the political alarms of its aftermath persuaded them that a crisis was at hand. In 1919, A.C. Gabalin, who had seen the Bolshevik Revolution as the rise of the beast in Russia, concluded that the beast was lifting its head in America, and that the world was going through a period that might end by giving birth to a world communist international in which our civilization and religion will be totally destroyed. According to Marsden, this perception of a nation in crisis gave such conservatives a new sense of urgency about the liberal apostasy in the churches and the decline of Christianity in the culture at large. Marsden is surely right, but it also seems the case that in the period of reaction that followed the war, many fundamentalists believed that they could win. The fundamentalist offensive included 3 separate endeavors. One was to build a nationwide interdenominational fundamentalist movement. Another was to take control of major northern denominations. And the third was a campaign to drive Darwinian evolution out of the public schools. These projects came from different quarters and were never coordinated, but the offensive on all 3 fronts took place more or less simultaneously. And at the beginning, it took most liberals by surprise. Even in 1919, few liberals understood the extent of the fundamentalist anger or appreciated that the stakes for them were nothing less than survival of Christian civilization in America. In the succeeding years, William Jennings Bryan became known as Mr. Fundamentalist, but the title should really have gone to William B. Riley, an activist minister who played a major role in all 3 of the fundamentalist campaigns. In 1917 to 19, he almost single-handedly launched the fundamentalist movement, but the idea of waging a holy war against modernism had occurred to him long before World War I. The son of a poor Kentucky farmer, Riley had trained for the ministry at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. There he had met Dwight Moody, and after assisting at some of his revivals, he had become one of the great man's most ardent disciples. In 1893, he took a pulpit in Chicago, and 4 years later moved on to Minneapolis to pastor the First Baptist Church. A tall, handsome man with a resonant voice and considerable oratorical powers, he was ambitious, aggressive, and unafraid of conflict. In the space of 5 years, he turned First Baptist from the private preserve of the Minneapolis Baptist elite into a huge fundamentalist church filled with working people and headed by a board he controlled. In the early years of the century, he conducted revivals across the region and, like Billy Sunday, made a name for himself, crusading against prostitution, gambling, alcohol, and corrupt city bosses who profited from the dens of iniquity. Unlike Sunday, however, he dressed like a banker and spoke from a position of high ecclesiastical authority. We need, he said on one crusade, a federation of these forces that shall bring down the whole hand of better public opinion upon the lawless and criminal classes, to teach those who have no regard for moral truth a sense of obedience to the law and who their masters are. So we know who their masters are. So they're placing all these moral laws, wanting to be in charge of morality and moral laws, whereas the liberal side is the way I look at it today is the state is not to, there's a civil law, not moral law. Simple way to put it. Civil law, not moral law. During his 4 years in Chicago, Riley had often debated University of Chicago Divinity School professors at meetings of the city's Baptist Association. In 1909, in response to a book by one of Shaler Matthews' colleagues, he wrote a book-length attack on the kind of theology practiced at the Divinity School. Professors at Chicago and seminaries like it, he charged, denied every fundamental of our holy faith, including biblical infallibility and the premillennial second coming. The result was an awful harvest of skepticism that endangered the very life of the church. It is not, he asked, high time. Is it not, he asked, high time the conservative and constructive ministers of our country united forces for the successful defense of the faith once delivered? When the University of Chicago was picked as a site for the 1910 Northern Baptist Convention, he wrote friends proposing that conservatives should gather in a Chicago church a few days before the convention to protest the creeping modernism in the denomination. His proposal, however, was not taken up, and Riley, otherwise occupied, dropped the matter until the crisis of World War I. So I don't know if anybody has any comments. I'm kind of reading along. Do you have comments or thoughts to add to here? Questions?
I do not.
Is that a no?
I do not.
Okay. So I'm trying to think through in my mind. We've got the moral and civil law. One side is about the moral law, pushing morality. On the other side, the modernists are viewed, it seems like from what we're understanding, from what I think, how I'm understanding it, the modernists are threatening their Christian identity. And when I take that into the perspective of today, look at the Democrats, they think that the Democrats are, you have a lot of Democrats that are Christian, but they're not about this union of church and state and pushing morality on people. By 1917, Riley was not only running a very large church and a Bible school, but he was editing religious journals and speaking at conferences across the country. That year, he published The Menace of Modernism, a book with a more alarming message than the first. Numerous antichrists, he reported, had invaded not just the seminaries, but also most of the institutions of American higher education. So that's the other thing, when they saw the modernists come in old school and new school, they saw the schools as being the ones that were taking everybody away from God. Okay, so including the state universities and many of the colleges founded as Christian schools. Within these hallowed halls of learning, professors were teaching Darwinism and contempt for biblical truth. In alliance with modernist ministers, They were attacking the nation's Christian heritage and undermining the moral foundations of the society. The book was pervaded by a sense of alarm about the danger to American culture. But as Riley's biographer, William Vance Trollinger, noticed, it also contained a note of personal animus. Arrogant college professors, Riley complained, pretend to be the only men who really think. They talk as if only uneducated people disagree with them, and ignore all the highly educated ministers who believe the Bible inherent and Darwinism unscientific. Modernist ministers, even those who could not fill a church with 400 people, he wrote, are welcomed by them as speakers, but conservatives have about as good a chance to be heard in the Turkish harem as to be invited to speak within the precincts of a modern state university. Wasn't there something just in the news about, I think I just read it today, that conservatives are not being welcomed in to speak in colleges? I don't know if anybody saw that. In his own fashion, Riley was alluding to an important development. Just 2 generations before, clergymen had headed most of the colleges and universities in the country, and pastors were regarded as intellectual leaders in their constituencies. But during the academic revolution of the 1890s, the universities had adopted standards of objectivity that relegated religion to the divinity schools. The secular elite was not a phrase in Riley's vocabulary, but he was perfectly right that college educators were undermining the cultural authority of the clergy and driving ministers, such as himself, out of the centers of American intellectual life. His anger at this alienation echoed through fundamentalist polemics for the rest of the century. Riley's book concluded with another call for a confederacy of true and evangelical conservatives to resist the onslaught of infidelism. And this time, his fellows responded. A regular on the premillennial conference circuit, Riley spoke at the Philadelphia Prophecy Conference in May 1918. That August, he met with other leaders at Reuben Torrey's summer home in Montrose, Pennsylvania, to lay plans for another conference in Philadelphia the following May. Impatient with the passivity of prophetic speculation, he persuaded the group to broaden the agenda of the forthcoming conference to the fundamentals of the faith and to commit to the formation of an interdenominational association of conservatives. When matters drifted, he used the November Prophecy Conference in New York to make preparations for a world conference on the fundamentals in the spring. So they believed with the socialism and communism threat, that's where they took their religious prophetic understanding to Russia being the Antichrist, if I understood correctly. Not that they said it there, but that's what I'm kind of picking up in different places. The May 1919 conference, advertised as the first meeting of the World Christian Fundamentals Association, attracted 6,000 people and extensive coverage in the regional newspapers. Riley and his fellow organizers spoke of a country in crisis where thousands of false teachers, many of them occupying high ecclesiastical positions, are bringing in damnable heresies. Excuse me. Let me find my place. Okay, and where a great apostasy was spreading like a plague. Still, they hold out hope for a national revival. The deans of all the major Bible schools spoke on points of doctrine, and a 9-point creed was adopted. Riley pronounced the event of more historic moment than the nailing up at Wittenberg of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. After the convocation, he took a group of singers and 14 speakers on a cross-country tour, holding 3 to 6 day conferences in the major cities along their path. The most extensive religious endeavor the country had seen for many years, the tour gave the Naissance movement national publicity and encouraged pastors across the country to join the cause. I think we better pause it there. We'll just mark our spot here. Okay, any comments as we've gone through this? I think we're gonna find, I'm getting more and more of this chapter after what we talked about here with the fundamental, this is the issue of the fundamental modernist versus fundamentalist, taking place during the 20s, 30s, and 40s leading up to, so this is the period of time leading up to Billy Graham. Does anybody have any comments?
I don't.
No? Okay, then we'll pick up here on Friday.
Okay,
If
sounds good.
somebody else wants to lead out and read, that would be great. So when we get into, I think what I was gonna say is when we get into chapter 5 and get into Billy Graham, that'll kind of tie in with what we're gonna, if I get that study done for next week, they'll tie in because we'll be able to be reading a lot of it, of the background of the rise of Billy Graham as well, and in that history. So maybe we'll get to that some on Friday. So if there's no comments or anything, Christine, would you like to close in prayer?
Sure. Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for drawing us all together for this study. We thank you for reviewing the Millerite history and the evangelical history, that we may understand better what's going on in our life today, and the end that's coming, because it's so it looks so obvious that it's going to happen just the way it's written. And we just pray that you will give us the strength and the courage and the faith and the wisdom to walk through it, that you will help us to always make the right choices, that we will always fall on the right side. Dear Father in heaven, we pray that you will help us all to come into harmony with each other, and be ready to do the good work that you have planned for us. We praise you, Lord, and we thank you. And we pray all this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.